Welcome everyone, it's Egwin here from Beyond Systems. Today we are talking about emotions again, more specifically about the topic on how emotions are actually stored in the body. This video is inspired by a conversation I had with a friend of mine recently where we were rambling about all things body and mechanics and emotions and mind, and at some point I referred to and also if there are stored emotions, like old emotional patterns that are stuck in the body and so on. And then she said, well, can you explain that a little bit? Like, how are emotions stored in the body, or how can they be stuck in the body? And it's a good thing that she asked, actually, because for me, this is already so totally normal to talk about that and not even think about it a second time on what's the actual mechanics behind that, because it's so clear. But I think that might be a very interesting question for many of you, especially when it comes to emotions. A lot is misunderstood, and what people tend to overlook is actually the fact that emotions have a very physical component to them. Actually, I explained that much more in detail in a separate video. I'm going to link it down below. But just to give you the baseline. So when we are looking at the body, emotions in the body are basically a physical reaction to a stimulus. Either a stimulus that comes from the outside or a stimulus that comes from an internal factor, like, for example, a memory or something like that. Let's keep it simple. Emotions are one of the most basic aspects of life. You can find what we learned to interpret with our mind as emotions or emotional pulsation, even in single-cell organisms. So basically, what we call emotions is a certain pulsational and intercommunicational pattern between our cells that is, again, an immediate reaction to an outside influence and a stimulus of some sort. It's either a contraction or an opening up. It's either a going into communication or cutting communication off, with different shades of variations, obviously, between them. And our brain then, through many different functional systems in the body, is able to pick up on those changes. Actually, in third and fourth line, that's when we actually become conscious about it. And that information then is interpreted by our conscious mind as something that we call love or fear or hate or depression or anxiety, and so on and so on and so on. But really, for more detail regarding that, I'm going to refer you to that other video I did and some other updates that I might do in the future. All right, now, how are emotions stored in the body? Obviously, there is a very physical component to emotions in the body. Without our physical body, it's very hard to actually perceive emotions the way that we are used to. There are two main components. One is a structural one, and one is a functional one. Let's start with a structural one. Now, let's imagine we have a person who suffers a severe trauma, both physical and emotional. They are most of the time linked. On a small side note here, every single memory that you have only gains its plasticity because of emotions attached to it. So whenever you go through your mind and try to remember something from your past, whether good or bad, the main reason why you're capable of remembering it very vividly is because you literally relive in parts the pulsation and the physical state that your body was in at the time when you experienced it in quote-unquote real life. So when you remember something, you replay the emotional state that you were in, combined with some additional mental components, but the mental components are actually much less precise than the emotional ones. The structural aspect, let's come back to that example. Say someone suffers a severe trauma. For example, someone is being raped. When that happens, more often than not, this is accompanied by very negative emotional states and physical tension that runs throughout the body. Tension patterns that are literally ingrained physically with such high structural tension, muscle contraction, that it has an effect on passive structures in the body as well. And there again, it fans out. There can be two components to that. Either one, a muscle structure goes so much into shock that actually, without the capacity to consciously let go of that experience, that muscle will stay in a higher tensional state permanently. That would then be the task of a body worker, a professional therapist, to structurally aid in the release of that muscle, and at the same time, when you combine it, say, with body-centered psychotherapy, and at the same time also work on that emotional correlation to that muscular tension. Tension patterns like that, at the beginning, they are acute, but then they can stay chronic and be forgotten over time because of that high tension pattern, the body tries to find a way to organize the rest of it in terms of coordination and balance around that structural tension block inside. And once that happens, it sort of becomes solidified in new movement patterns, habitual patterns that develop on top of it. And then potentially even 50, 20, 30 years later, you still see that same old tension pattern that came from a trauma. I chose the example of rape because that's something extremely intense. But obviously there are many shades of gray in this. It just can be the loss of a loved one or whatever it might be. The second component to that, so one component of that structural aspect would be muscular tension, where literally the movement was not completed and it was never let go again. So the muscle sort of is stuck in an activation loop, and because of that, it just can't let go until it is most often helped from the outside. The second component would be the passive structure. Passive structures in this specific case would be our connective tissue mainly. I mean, a lot of structures in the body belong to the connective tissue category. This alone is worth probably 10 videos, so I'm only going to touch on to it really briefly. Suffice it to say, the connective tissue really wraps around all the organs. The connective tissue wraps around all the muscles, is also interwoven in the muscles, and so on. And when you have a very, very intense tensional pattern going on, whether that's through an emotional trauma or a physical trauma, say you're breaking a bone or you're twisting your ankle or something like that, whenever there is high mechanical input, the connective tissue can be, the free function of the connective tissue can be limited or damaged in a certain way. This can either be a detachment of connective tissue layers that are supposed to be connected with each other, that eventually then start to create new fibers to counteract that detachment and reinitiate some sort of stability, which more often than not is less adaptable than the prior version. And the other option is that connective tissue actually starts to stick more together and is not really released anymore, partially because of the muscular tension that might still be in there as a trauma pattern, and sometimes literally just because of that massive impact. Like whenever you, for instance, you have a car accident or something like that, and you get a really hard bump on your structure, then that mechanical impulse from the outside is stuck in the connective tissue. You can literally see and feel as a therapist the pathway the mechanical external force went through the body. In severe emotional distress and trauma, it's totally the same thing. So those pathways, you can also create them through internal tension. Now you might say, okay, but not always is emotional trauma necessarily a very, very intense one. That's true, but think about it like that. When you're exposed to a low-level emotional trauma, a low-level impact of some sort for prolonged periods of time, not just for 2 weeks, but for months and months on end, or literally years, then over time you develop a certain habitual pattern because your body is sort of being pushed back in a specific response pattern over and over and over again. And ways to damage the physical structure is either through an overload of a mechanical system where you have more mechanical input than that structure can actually digest or compensate for, or you just go repetitively with a low-level impulse. So those are the two options, either traumatic with a very hard component, or the second one with repetition and a chronic state. The functional components are a little bit more complex, but still very understandably, I suppose. Functionally, we have a couple of different things going on in the body and a couple of different potential times when trauma can happen. So in a nutshell, when the pulsation of a cell and its communication with its neighboring cells changes, the first system in the body that picks up on that is actually the liquid system. So the connective tissue system that transmits that information in form of liquid dispersal waves through the body, liquid pressure waves that run through the body, way quicker actually than our nervous system acts. And that pressure differential is then being picked up by the enteric nervous system in our gut, which again sends its information back to the brain. So that's the first involvement in an emotional reaction, a first neurological involvement in an emotional reaction that is triggered from the outside. Then the brain immediately reacts to that with contraction of the smooth muscles in the body. Contraction of the smooth muscles. Smooth muscles surround all our organs, and you can find some of them closer to our bones. Now that's the next muscular reaction, and then that triggers the motor receptors in the body to jump onto that contraction of the smooth muscles, which again is feedback into the brain, and the brain picks up on that. And that's the first time when you are actually conscious about what's happening. And that's the point where you can decide whether or not to throw that punch, or whether or not to run away, or to hide, or to freeze, and so on and so on. Decide whether or not you just stay here, wait it out. The freeze, the shock freeze, actually is one layer before. Or, like I said, you decide to go into a fight or into a flight mode situation. Functionally speaking, when you're exposed, like I said before in the structural component, when you're exposed to a certain emotional stimulus over and over and over again, whether that is because the outside stimulus just does not subside, or it is an internal stimulus because you had some very intense traumatic experience and you just keep replaying it sort of in the back of your head over and over again because you simply do not have the capacity of letting it go in that specific moment, then what happens is that you trigger and trigger and trigger and trigger and trigger the same pathways again. This can literally lead to a very specific neurological and synaptic pathway that is created in your brain that perfectly resembles that trauma pattern. Now, such a pathway does not emerge out of nowhere with just one impulse. But when it's an over and over and over and over replay, either through thinking, continuous circular thinking about the situation, or, like I said, a continuous external trigger that sort of always hits into the same groove, then those neurological pathways, the synaptic pathways, actually form and create an emotional reactive pattern that is physically ingrained in your brain. And that's then much easier triggered in any situation where a certain stress level is reached than any other type of emotion. So in order to regain some of your adaptability and emotional intelligence, it's actually important to work on those trauma patterns as well. Functionally speaking, there are a couple of more possibilities, especially when it comes to how we use our body. I'm going to do a separate video about that, but just so we touch onto it real quick here, certain reactive patterns that we learn, that we pick up on. Say, when we are children and we see our parents react to certain emotions or to certain situations, let's call them situations, in a specific way, with specific movements, with specific tension patterns in the body. And yes, subconsciously, every single one of us is able to pick up on the tension patterns that are going on, quote unquote, under the skin of another person. It's just for most people, unless they're trained as a therapist, they're not consciously aware of that. They're not capable of reading those patterns consciously, but every single one of us subconsciously picks up on those. And so if you grew up in an environment where certain emotions were more present than others, and certain situations were always met with the same emotional response and the same structure, the same strategy, the same way of doing things, then this can become an emotional response habit really quick, especially when you learn it, quote unquote, copy it better, in very young years. Now, whenever you're exposed later on in your life to a situation, again, your body, both through structural and muscle memory, where the emotional response of your cellular pulsation, cellular intercommunication, and of course the energetic component, but we're talking body right now, where this is linked with a specific mental realization of an emotion and an emotional response, also from the hormone levels in the body, from the breathing pattern, and so on, then you just dig your own grave, quote unquote, and work yourself deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper again back into that specific pattern. And that is another one of those functional connections that over time then actually has an effect on how the body reacts. Also, the capacity to express certain emotions depends largely on your overall capacity of tensing and relaxation of muscles. And again, whether or not we are talking about an outside triggered event, like a real threat, a real stressful situation, a situation where you actually lose someone, a situation where something bad happens to you right now, or we're talking about something like you had a bad experience, or you hear something that makes you sad, and so on and so on, and it's more triggered from the inside, from a neurological response pattern out towards the physical one. So where a memory, like I said before, relives, reinstates a physical reaction in the body, it really does not matter. From both sides, the physical body, is always at the center of perceiving emotions and also of dealing with them. We also know that breathing has a lot of positive effects, or can have a lot of positive effects on our emotional state. But breathing is also a wonderful indicator of what emotional state we are in. Say when the breathing pattern gets erratic or is more a shallow and fast breath, and so on and so on. So all of that, it's actually an expression of an emotional pattern that is going on the inside. In a nutshell, you could call an emotional pattern a certain pulsation and intercommunicational pattern in the body that is then read by our mind and identified as a certain emotion that we give a name. Yeah, and those are things that you learn as a child. You see tears are running out of your mother's eyes, and she's making a sighing sound and slightly crunching together, and she calls that crying and being sad. That's how you learn. Your body learns, your mind learns to identify the similar pattern in yourself. But the emotional response pattern in itself is one of the most fundamental and basic functions that every single one of us humans actually has. And every single biological organism actually has, only that some have the capacity to actually mentalize it, to put a name to it, but the response is the same. It's an automated response to a certain stimulus. And that obviously has a lot to do with how this body is capable of reacting with the outside. All right, I hope this clarifies a little bit of how a physical pattern can be stored or remembered and linked to an emotional component. So whenever an emotion reaches a certain intensity level or is connected to a repetitive pattern, then a physical component that actually stays way longer than the actual presence of that emotion is very likely. And that is something where a lot of therapy can actually touch onto. That's why body-centered psychotherapy, why body work, deep body work, for example, postural integration, which is sort of a deep tissue massage combined with psychotherapy again, where such methods really come into place and have amazing positive effects on dissolving old emotional habitual patterns. And if that goes together with actually learning about those patterns, understanding them, and then having better tools in the future to deal with them, wow, then you're good. All right, so the positive message is, yes, those patterns are being stored, but, and that's it, you can do something about it. It's possible to do something about those stored patterns. And I think I'll leave you with that for now. If you have any questions regarding that, let me know. I'm going to post some more updates down that line in the next days. Have a beautiful time. Thank you for watching and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, then please do so. Click the subscribe button down below and hit the notification bell. Also, if you know anyone who might be interested in this topic and you think, oh, they might benefit from this video, then please feel free to share and also like the video